In this lesson, we're going to be looking a little more in depth at finding percent change. Read the problem below, then explore different ways to find percent change. Nassim scored 5 goals in his first soccer season and 8 goals in his second season. What is the percent increase in the number of goals he scored? So we have a few important pieces of information in this problem. We know in his first season he has 5 goals, and in his second season he has 8 goals. And the problem wants us to find the percent increase. One way we can look at that is with a picture. You can use a bar model to compare the change in the original amount. So remembering the original is 100%. So we know that originally in his first game, he scored 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 goals. So that's why we have 5 boxes. 1 to represent each goal. Then we know that the change from the first game to the second game was 3 goals, because altogether 6, 7, 8 goals. He had 8 goals the second season. So that change, there was a change of 3 goals. And what we want to be able to determine is, well, what is that percent change? Well, if we know 5 goals is 100%, and we know that 100%, halfway between that is 50%, and that's halfway there with my green line. So I know it's a little bit more than 50%. Let's look at some other ways that we can interpret this to maybe get a more exact answer. We can model this situation with a proportion. You can use a proportion to compare the change in the original, to compare the change to the original. So we're comparing the change to the original. So it's the change over the original. Well, we did have to calculate that change by subtracting 8 minus 5. So our change is 3. And originally in the first game, he scored 5. On the other side of our proportion, you see we have our percents. We don't know what percent he scored the second time, but we do know that he originally scored 100%. So remember, when we're setting up a proportion, on the left side of our proportion, we have how many goals. And on the right side, we have our percent. And then going across, we have the change on the top, and across the bottom we have the original. So remember, when you're setting up this proportion, you have to make sure everything is lined up, that you have the things in common on the left and the other things in common on the right, and then in common going across. Once you have a proportion set up, you can then cross multiply 3 times 100 divided by 5. Let's look at a few questions that help think this through with us. Solve the proportion and model it on the previous page. So the proportion on the previous page that we just talked about, 3 to 5 equals what to 100? So just like we talked about just a second ago, we're going to cross multiply 3 times 100 and then divide by 5. So when we cross multiply 3 times 100, that equals 300. And then 300 divided by 5, you may need to come to the side of your paper, equals 60. By what percent did the number of goals Nassim scored increase? It increased by 60%. So just by setting up that proportion, cross multiply and divide, you see it increased by 60%. And remember what we talked about in the picture, that green line, remember that was halfway, so that was 50%. And we said that our percent change we were finding was a little bit more than 50. And 60 is a little bit more than 50. Number 3, explain the relationship between the x in the proportion and the x in the bar model and tell what each x represents. So remember on the previous page, the x in the bar model, so that x that's circled in green, and then in the model that x in your proportion. So number 3 wants you to explain the relationship between those two. Well, the relationship is that they are the same. That x represents the same thing. It's just in 2 different situations, 2 different ways that we can solve it. And what that x represents, or what that tells you, is they both represent writing the ratio 3 to 5 as a percent. So they're both doing that. They're both telling you that 60%. Nassim scored 12 goals in his third game. Write and solve a proportion to show the percent increase in the number of goals he scored from the first to the third. So some important information here. 12 goals in the third season. And it wants you to get the percent increase from the first to the third. So in the first season, remember he scored 5. So we have to remember we start by finding that difference. So we have to do 12 minus what he scored in that first season. 12 minus 5 is 7. So that's our change. So to write a proportion, it's our change, that's 7 over our original. So originally he scored 5 goals in the first season, equals, we're trying to find the percent increase over 100. Now that proportion is set up correctly, I can cross multiply 7 times 100 and divide by 5. 7 times 100 equals 700. 700 divided by 5. If you need to go to the side of your paper, you can. Is 140. So our percent increase is 140% from season 1 to 3. Because we're comparing his first season to his third season. There's 143% increase. Number 5, what does it mean to have a percent increase of more than 100? So we talked about that when you have 100% increase, that means times 1. And we talked about a 200% increase means times 2. So use that information that we've previously talked about and describe in your own words what does it mean to have a percent increase of more than 100%. So more than 100% means that it's going to be more than doubling the starting or the original amount. It's not quite as much as multiplying by 2, but it's somewhere in between there because it's 140%. Next, explain why it makes sense for the original amount to be the denominator when you write a proportion to find the change in percent. I want you to pause the video and take a minute to think about this question. Explain why it makes sense for your original amount, your original amount to be the denominator when you're setting up that proportion. Pause the video, think about it, and then write your answer. So the original amount is the whole amount. So remember when he had that first soccer season, his whole amount was those 5 goals. And then what happened? So his original amount is the whole amount he had that first season. So his whole amount was 5 goals. Then a change happened. So remember when you have a fraction, it's part over whole. Well, your whole amount is usually what you start with, and then you have a change. So that's why your bottom number is your original amount, because that's what your whole amount is until it either increases or decreases. Go ahead and highlight number 7 and number 8.